Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Hello, salam, and welcome to What the Patriarchy, where we are trying to dismantle the patriarchy, one Muslim feminist theme or issue or book at a time, or in some cases, one chapter of a Muslim feminist book at a time. Thank you so much for watching. This is Shahnaz Haqqani. In my latest two videos, I pointed out first how selfish men are when they themselves choose not to cover much of their body while they require women, the women of their households, their female partners, their daughters, sisters, etc., to do so. And second, that traditional patriarchal modesty standards are an inconvenience to women, but they benefit men. And that is how you know that they're not from God, but that they are from some other source, and that other source is the patriarchy. In this video, I'm continuing that discussion and making this very, very clear point. Patriarchal modesty standards as we practice them and as we understand them, set women up for failure, for sin, and for hellfire. They are hypocritical, they sometimes are a danger to women's lives, and they are they are rooted in double standards and myths like treating the woman's body as a sex object, or a myth like their bodies are more sexually provocative than men's are. First, I do want to acknowledge though that, and I want to appreciate the fact that modesty standards as we practice them depend very much on who we are, on our family culture, on our household culture, on the local community that we're a part of, and on the broader culture that we come from, the broader society. There are no universal modesty standards, thank God. And they change with time, with context, with culture, with people, with places, also, thank God. Not even two Muslim families have the same exact idea on modesty. Also, thank God. Some are more conservative than others, some are more liberal than others, and neither is more Islamic or less Islamic than the other. Partly because nearly all modesty standards as we know them as Muslims come not from the Quran or even the Sunnah, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ's teachings, but from fiqh, which is an entirely male-made tradition filled with misogynistic ideas about women. There are some good things in it too, but mostly it is very deeply patriarchal. But mostly, the modesty standards that you and I know and that we probably practice are filled with hypocrisies and ironies and double standards and injustices and harms. Why is it so much easier in a patriarchy to control women than to simply teach men to be decent people, to respect women? Why inconvenience and limit women for the shortcomings or the supposed shortcomings of men? They tell us, oh, you can't control what others do, but you can control what you do. Great! Can you tell the men that? That you can't control as a man what other people are going to do, what the women will do, what the women will wear and don't wear, but you can control your own self. And when you rape people or how you harm people or what you say to people because they're not dressed the way that you think they should be, they're not being modest or whatever. So you can control yourselves too. Why does nobody give men that message? I have a few points to make. So first, patriarchal modesty standards set women up for hellfire and sin. You see, these rules as we know them of how much women are supposed to cover, of how much women are required to cover, but men not, set us up for failure, for sin, for hell even, because if you believe that women must cover themselves, and if they don't, then they go to hell, we are automatically being set up for hellfire. Simply by the design of our bodies, of women's bodies, if you believe that only a person with a uterus and a vagina and breasts like most women have is required to cover herself in a certain way, then you're setting us up for sin. Men have legs too. They have arms and a chest too. Why don't they have to cover the arms and the legs and the chest? Like, what is the alternative to a head covering for men? What is the alternative to the covering of legs and arms for men? Now, don't get me wrong. I know that men in some Muslim majority cultures do cover their heads. My dad, for a long time, used to cover his head when he prayed with a little topi. But they're not required to do so religiously or even culturally. And when they leave that cultural context, that specific setting in which they're covering their heads, they take that head covering off when they're somewhere else very easily, probably no guilt. By design, then, women are set up to sin more than men because only women can go to hell for showing their arms or legs or breasts and so on. If God, the creator of all of the universes, of all the worlds, who created every single gender in the world, is going to create rules, they're not going to be so drastically different for one group of people, like in this case for women, than for another. And then send that one group to hell because they didn't follow those particular rules. Because only they could then, by definition, go to hell if they didn't follow those rules. By design, by default, women end up going to hell for something that men don't have to because the rules don't exist for men. That is how we set women up for hellfire, for sin, and for failure. The second point that I want to make is patriarchal modesty standards can be a danger to some women's lives, to many women's lives, in fact. Try not being modest as a woman who comes from a family where modesty is a very, very big deal. Usually not for men, but much more for women. What are the consequences for quote-unquote immodest women? What are the consequences for immodest men, quote-unquote immodest men? For men who don't cover their full bodies when they're out, who wear shorts, who go to a mixed gender gym or whatever, and so on. But what about the consequences for women? But also beyond these consequences from the family, from specific individual families, beyond what people say, covering yourself fully as a human, as a person, from head to toe in a non-appropriate piece of cloth or fabric, in a particular context like in the heat or in the water when you're swimming, is a danger to your life, which is another reason these rules are not from God. God wants us to live and to not die. The third point that I want to make is that modesty standards, as we practice them, are a form of kufr, disbelief, which the Quran really does not like. Clearly, I'm not talking about Islamic modesty standards here. I'm talking about patriarchal ones. For me, patriarchy and Islam are not synonymous. They're not inseparable. None of this hypocrisy is Islamically acceptable. And Islam is very, very clearly, very unequivocally and explicitly against hypocrisies. The Quran despises hypocrites. And hypocrites are often linked with the kuffar. Hypocrisy is often linked with kufr. Kufr literally means deliberately hiding or denying the truth. So kufr and hypocrisies are intertwined intimately in the Quran, even synonymous in the Quran at times, which makes all of this hypocrisy that we see around us when we practice double standards and modesty standards. This practice that we see is a form of kufr. Take a look at the screenshot of a tweet by a hypocritical Muslim dude who expects hijabis to not be at clubs or to be smoking or to be drinking alcohol or whatever else because they disrupt his enjoyment. It's like he's there to enjoy himself because the world is designed for him to enjoy himself. And when a woman, when her ideas of modesty collides with his, she's disrupting his pleasure. And he tells us this. He tells on himself. I know men personally who themselves have sex before marriage or outside of marriage. They commit adultery. They drink alcohol. They go clubbing, etc. All of these things that they think is wrong and Islamically unacceptable. But when women do it, when women do the exact same thing, even something like smoking cigarettes, if women do the same thing, these men get angry. And they report these women to whoever they think has control over them, like their families or their communities and their fathers and so on. Some such men even think that women who live like this, who do drinking and clubbing and wear whatever they want to wear, etc., deserve to be physically disciplined. In the community that I grew up in the US, there was a story, a very, very famous story of a woman who had been caught in she was at a club or something. And the man who saw her, also from our community, he was also Pashtun, he took secret pictures of her and he sent those pictures to everyone in the community. My family found out about it, for example. And he was trying to get her to be punished, right? To be disciplined. No one was asking, hey man, so you were there too? And why were you there, but she couldn't be there? Or why can you go clubbing, but she can't? Why can you drink alcohol, but she can't? I don't know, whatever it is that's supposed to have happened. He faced absolutely no consequences and was instead treated as a hero for catching, right, this innocent woman. There are no punishments in Islam for immodesty, y'all. There are no punishments for immodesty, whatever immodesty is. Like if you don't cover your hair or your legs or your arms or whatever else that you're supposed to, quote unquote, supposed to cover, there's no punishment for you. No one else, no human gets to punish you because you're immodest. We are not to harm people just because their ideas of modesty are different from ours. Now, if you're saying that adultery is immodest and there is a punishment in the Quran for it, you're right. The flogging business is in the Quran, but for both genders. And also, probably not because it is immodest, but because it has other kinds of consequences. It's cheating, so it's unethical. So it's something that you do that's unethical. The lack of ethics there is what is being punished by God. But still, it's not gendered. Both genders get punished for it. The fourth point that I want to make is, what does it mean for something to be fardh, to be an obligation in Islam for us? And how do we know when something is an obligation and when something is simply a recommendation? So then you might be asking, what are we supposed to do with the fact that, quote unquote, Islam does have clear ideas of modesty? But it doesn't. It doesn't have clear ideas of modesty. The Islamic tradition conveniently agrees that women must cover their hair despite the fact that it's not in the Quran. But not all women must cover their hair. There's some really interesting patriarchy going on here. If you're a menopausal woman, if you've reached menopause, you're not considered attractive enough to cover your hair. You're not considered desirable. So you don't need to be covering your hair at all. If you're generally considered unattractive, then you don't have to worry about modesty rules either. The tradition is like, hey, unattractive girls, you can go to the mosque, that's okay. But if you're attractive, you can't go to the mosque. Or we ask that you not go to the mosque because, you're so pretty and a man might get turned on if he sees you at the mosque. And enslaved women were not allowed to cover their hair either. Not allowed. Not even that they were discouraged or they shouldn't. They were not allowed to cover their hair. The Khalifa Umar, for example, there are reports about him beating up a woman who's enslaved because she dared to cover her hair. And he's like, you're a slave woman. Covering as a question of status, not of gender. You shouldn't be covering your hair if you're a slave, if you're not a free woman. I already have a video on the hijab and head covering in the Quran and in Islam, and I talk more about the distinction between free women and enslaved women and who's allowed to cover and who's supposed to cover and who's not, and so on. So you can watch that for more details. So when it comes to modesty standards, then we have to start asking questions like, why? How so? According to whom? How do we know this? Where does God say XYZ, whatever this particular rule is supposed to be? What does modesty mean to God? And why are we reducing modesty to only what we wear, what a person wears? Modesty is a beautiful concept, a potentially beautiful concept, but has been destroyed by patriarchy or the patriarchal ideas that we have of it to ensure that women are, again, inconvenienced and controlled by it. When someone tells you that something is haram, you have to start asking questions. You have to say, where? Ask them for evidence. Where is it stated that this is haram? How is it worded in the Quran that this is haram? When is something simply a discouragement, something we're being discouraged from doing versus it being haram? And also, even if we agree that head covering for women is in the Quran, and we don't because it's not in the Quran, we have to then ask, is not covering your hair haram? Is it forbidden? Is there hellfire as a result of this? Does not covering our hair take us to hellfire? Does it hurt God's feelings? And ew, if it hurts God's feelings, like, what a petty little God. And why on earth would you worship or believe in a God who's so petty and so sexist and so abusive? Who cares more about whether a woman's hair is covered or uncovered, right? Whether she's smoking or she's drinking alcohol or whether she's going clubbing or not, then what happens in this grand universe that this same God supposedly created? This God sounds a lot more to me like an insecure, sexist, abusive, controlling man who likes to control women than the creator, sustainer of the world. God, you see, God isn't petty. So start asking more questions about the sources of the information that you get on modesty and Islam. Like, think, for example, about the fact that what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and his male companions probably wore in the 7th century, in 7th century Arabia, isn't obligatory for all Muslim men everywhere in the world, but somehow, magically, what the women of his time wore is obligatory for all Muslim women at all places, everywhere, for eternity. How ridiculous, unreasonable is this? And according to whom, first of all? And again, even if it was in the Quran, and it's not, can we talk more about what exactly it means when we say something is obligatory and that something is haram? The 5th point that I want to make is that patriarchal modesty standards allow men to get away with all kinds of horrible behaviors. In my last video related to modesty, where I said that men who wear swimsuits or men who wear clothing for swimming when they're swimming, but don't allow women, so who wear little clothing when they swim, but don't allow women that they know or love to do the same thing, or who show more skin in public for whatever reasons, in any context, but don't allow the women in their households to do the same thing, are selfish. A dude said to me in response to that statement, but women's bodies are provocative and sexy, and so here's what I told him. If you find every woman's body sexually arousing, something is deeply disturbingly wrong with you. And that is objectifying women. It's treating them as a sex object. It's ironically what modesty standards end up doing despite claiming otherwise, treating women as sex objects that are created only to arouse men, apparently. Thinking of women as seductive more so than men, as a result of which women should be controlled more, is a very unhealthy way of living. But also, for whom is a woman's body provocative and sexy, quote unquote? And what does that even mean? And so what if women's bodies are provocative and sexy? Even if it is sexy, even if the woman's body is sexy and provocative, why is that a limiting factor for the woman and not for the man? Is the assumption that a man will hurt a woman who is not covered? Then why not limit the man instead of the woman? Why not keep the man hidden in the house and not the woman? Why punish the woman? And is a man's body not sexy and provocative? Yes, these rules are different for men because guess who made the rules and guess who benefits from them? Heterosexual men who refuse to trust and listen to and honor and respect women's bodies and their voices and their opinions and their feelings, and who instead allow themselves to roam the earth freely while forbidding the same thing for women. Bottom line though, let's stop excusing and enabling the inappropriateness of insecure, abusive, controlling men who see women as sex objects and therefore control them and decide what makes women modest and immodest. Which brings me to my 6th point, which is why inconvenience and limit women for the shortcomings or the supposed shortcomings of men. We have to ask, why do we consistently punish women for the supposed sins of men? And not real sins, right? These are supposed sins. These are things attributed to men that aren't really true. This is what patriarchy expects of men. Patriarchy reduces men to helpless, insecure, uncontrollable little creatures who have no self-discipline, who have no self-control whatsoever, and who are apparently incapable of ever changing and ever learning to be better and safer for the world. It is patriarchy that expects men to not manage their feelings and their emotions appropriately, to not handle them appropriately. We have to start demanding better of those men, of the men in our families, in our households, the men around us, to whom these limitations supposedly apply, to whom these limitations are attributed. This is not acceptable. Men are not monsters. They are not dangerous inherently. They can be, and they become dangerous when we allow them to become dangerous with ideas like, oh, but women's bodies are sexy and men can't help themselves. The 7th point that I want to make, it's kind of already been made, but let's be a lot more explicit now. Patriarchal modesty standards treat women as sex objects. Religious patriarchal modesty standards treat women as sex objects. This is all so ironic to me, as I said in my response to the guy who was like, but women's bodies are so sexy and provocative. It's ironic to me because religious patriarchy tries to claim that these standards are designed to benefit women. It's a form of gaslighting, by the way. Because otherwise, men will treat women's bodies as sex objects, it tells us. Again, gaslighting. But if you actually think about this a little, It's religious patriarchy, like non-religious patriarchies to be sure, because every patriarchy does this, whether it's religious or not, that treats women's bodies as sex objects. Because the woman's body is treated as a sexy but dangerous thing that is a source of evil for all of society, or specifically for the quote-unquote opposite sex. There was a time when Muslim male scholars in the past literally called the woman fitna, disruptive or disruption or chaos or trouble, etc., because of how powerful women's sex drive, they said, is. They worried that if we were allowed to let our inner sexiness out, and if we were given sexual freedom, then we would destroy society and families and so on by having sex with every man, apparently, that comes about. But that's only in the fiqh. So the Islamic tradition historically has multiple ideas on the female sex drive. People have written books about this. In the fiqh, women's sex drive is weaker than a man's. But in the other Islamic literature and genres of scholarship, women are treated as having an extremely high sex drive. And that is why we should control them. So in both cases, somehow, magically, whether we have a high sex drive or a low sex drive, the result is the same. Control women, inconvenience women, benefit men. Keep women hidden from the public view. Don't give them any freedom. Treat them as a private property of the men around, of the men in their lives, and give men more freedom, like having up to 4 wives and sex with enslaved women and having temporary marriages and a whole bunch of other stuff. In both cases, whether we have a high drive or a high sex drive or a low sex drive, men are the ones who are benefiting from that. Why else do we have to cover everything that a man doesn't? Why not teach men to behave and control and discipline themselves and to respect women's bodies and other people's bodies and presence? Why is it so much easier in a patriarchy to control women than to simply teach men to be decent people, to respect women? They tell us, oh, you can't control what others do, but you can control what you do. Great. Can you tell the men that you can't control as a man what other people are going to do, what the women will do, what the women will wear and don't wear, but you can control your own self? Why does nobody give men that message? But we, the women, get that all the time. You can't control what a man does, but you can control what you do. Tell the men the same exact thing. I have a whole chapter, I said this in a previous video, but I have a whole chapter on the patriarchy of enabling and facilitating and excusing male entitlement to women's bodies, to just the public space in my upcoming book, in my chapter on female-led prayers, because it is very, very especially relevant there. So stay tuned for that book because I will announce it when it comes out. Inshallah, it is scheduled for October of 2024. Also, I realized recently that this is all about respect too. Do Muslim men who think that women shouldn't be in the public, or women shouldn't wear perfume, or women should be modest and they shouldn't be sexy in the public and so on, do they go up to their bosses or other women who are in charge of them to say, hey, you're too pretty, your voice is too sexy, your body is too sexy, you're dressed too provocatively, or whatever, right? Your presence is too attractive for me, so you're too pretty, or you smell too good, and so I can't be around you, and so I'm going to have to stop working here. I'm going to go leave this workplace and go somewhere else. No, they don't do that because they respect their bosses, and if they don't, there are consequences. Not respecting their bosses has consequences for them. So pay attention to when patriarchal men, whether Muslim or not, with their sexist ideas of women's bodies and presence and sexiness in the public and so on, when they speak up, and who they control and who they don't control. All right, that's all for now. Thank you so much for watching, for listening, and I hope that you stay peaceful. And with the summer coming, please, please, please be respectful of people's bodies and their freedom to be who they want to be. Please, please be a little bit more mindful, a little bit more thoughtful and respectful about how women behave and dress in the public, at the beach, at the pool, etc. And a little bit more respectful of their bodies today than you were yesterday, and then more tomorrow than you were today, and so on. Okay? Thanks again. Salam.